Hello and welcome to another session in Colossians. Thank you so much for joining us. Now today I want to begin with something that might seem a little strange to talk about, and it's slavery, the role of slavery in society. Now when you hear slavery, you probably do what I do and you think of the American slave trade in the 17 and 1800s. It was a deplorable and disgusting thing, but we really kind of have to adjust our mental image of slavery when we think about slavery in biblical times. Let me give you some contrast between the American slave trade and the slavery that was present in the ancient world. So it's believed that a few 100,000 African slaves were brought to the United States during the American slave trade. Compare that to this astounding figure. 250,000 slaves were sold a year in the Roman Empire. Can you imagine that? 250,000 slaves every year for hundreds and hundreds of years. So the slave trade in the Roman Empire was vast and it was ubiquitous. It met in every part of society. Here's another difference in the ancient slave trade. Many are surprised to find that slavery in the ancient world wasn't based on race. In fact, there were slaves of all races. And if you owned a slave, you might own a slave of your same race, because slavery was not based on race. In fact, here are the ways that people became slaves in the ancient world. First of all, they were captured during war. A huge number of slaves were taken from the ranks of enemy armies and also the civilians that were captured during battles. And so when a nation engaged in war, they knew that this was a possible outcome, that their people could be enslaved. This comprised the majority of slaves in the ancient world. Now that's pretty different than the American slave trade. Another way that people became slaves was by what we call debt slavery. So if you got into debt or you took on a loan and you defaulted on that loan, you weren't able to pay, you could either sell yourself and your family members into slavery to pay that debt, or it could be forcibly done to you. So debt and loan collection was a huge way that people fell into slavery. Now in this case, when the loan was paid, then the slave would be freed. Now the third way that people became slaves in the ancient world was by piracy and being kidnapped. Now in this case, what would happen is a slave ship would show up and it might capture an entire tribe or group of people and go to another port and sell them into slavery. Now, even the Roman Empire agreed that this was unlawful, that this was deplorable. Now, here's the thing to remember. The American slave trade was based almost completely on this premise, kidnapping by piracy. And so even the American slave trade in the ancient world would be looked down upon. In fact, there were Roman laws against this. It's said that the warships from Pompeii had largely destroyed the piracy slave trade in the Mediterranean during its time of power. So this was something that the Roman Empire was constantly fighting against. Nonetheless, there were still slaves that were captured, kidnapped by piracy. So we see a pretty big contrast between the American slave trade and the slave trade of the ancient world. Now, let's talk about the kind of jobs that people did as slaves. First and foremost, we have to get this idea out of the way that it was all hard labor. Not all slavery was hard labor. In fact, it was mostly just criminals who worked mines and quarries. If you committed a crime and then were thrown into slavery because of that, which was a possibility, then often you would be sent to the mines and the quarries, especially if it was a violent crime. But most slaves actually worked in households or in urban environments where they would do much more normal jobs to us. For instance, a slave might be a barber or a cook or a hairdresser, or they might wash their master's clothes or nanny or be a teacher or a secretary, a seamstress, accountant, or a physician. Now you see a really big range here from a barber to a doctor. All of these are jobs that slaves fulfilled in the ancient world. This begins to shift our idea of what slavery was in that context, because you could be a slave and you could be a highly skilled worker in the ancient world. Now, you could also be a slave and be a day laborer or a hard manual laborer, but the majority of slaves, it seems, were engaged in jobs like this. It's believed that about 40% of the population of the Roman Empire, which was the empire in power when the New Testament was written, about 40% of them were slaves. So there were lots of jobs that were filled by slaves. Now here's another difference in ancient slavery. Slaves, generally speaking, were allowed to be paid. Especially highly skilled slaves, they would be allowed to hire themselves out when they had free time to other employers, and they could be paid for that. Now, not all were allowed to do that, but it was a common practice. Another common practice was that slaves were allowed to save money. Why would they save money? Well, they were allowed also to own property. So they could save money and potentially buy property and sort of prepare for the day that they would be set free. And they were often allowed to buy their own freedom if they could save up the amount of capital that they needed to do that. Now, clearly not all slaves were able to do this, especially criminals. This would not have been a possibility. But for those average kind of normal jobbed slaves, this was the way their life looked. And so what I like to say about it is that for a slave in the ancient world, life could be pretty good. Now, it could also be really, really bad. But it could be an okay lifestyle. It could be a normal lifestyle. But on the end of each spectrum, it could be extremely good or it could be extremely bad. Let me give you some examples. If you were a criminal and had to work in the quarries and the mines, your life expectancy was short. In fact, the life expectancy in the Roman Empire was around 17 years old, but that's because so many died in their young life. Now, if you were a slave that worked in a household, your life expectancy was actually much better. In fact, commentators say that slaves of wealthy households actually lived much better than average citizens who were free. And so you could be a slave and have a very comfortable lifestyle, or you could be a slave and have a very difficult lifestyle. Now, this probably is beginning to sound familiar to your own life, right? I mean, you're not a slave. I'm taking a guess that if you're watching this in the modern world, you're not a slave. But guess what? You have some similarities to slaves in that you might be a barber or a cook or a hairdresser or a nanny or a teacher or a secretary, a seamstress, an accountant, or a physician. You see, the jobs that used to be filled by slaves in the ancient world, they're filled by us, free people, now. And so what that means for us is that whether you're a slave or a hired worker, the verses that we're going to look at in this session, they apply to you. So Paul is talking specifically to slaves, but they really do apply to anybody that does work of any kind. So with all of that said, let's take a look at what Paul has to say in verse 22 of chapter 3 of Colossians. Here's his words. Slaves, obey your human masters in everything. Don't work only while being watched as people pleasers, but work wholeheartedly, fearing the Lord. That's Colossians 3:22. Now, this strikes really close to home for many of us, I'm sure. In fact, I was talking to a young man not long ago who said one of his early jobs, it was years ago, is he had an office that was kind of off of the beaten path. And it was very, very uncommon for his boss to stick his head in his office and look in. And so this young man in his office had a bunch of old computers that were just being stored there. They weren't being used. They were just stacked up kind of in the corner. And so this young man took those computers and he stacked them in such a way that he could crawl back behind them into this little cave that he had created. And he would crawl back there on days when he was on the clock and he would take a nap. Now, because his job was partially in the office and partially out of the office, if anybody ever did stick their head in the door to see if he was in the office, they would look around, they'd see his computer was on and the lights were on, and they just assume, well, he's probably somewhere, but he's not in his office, when in reality, he was actually behind that stack of computers snoozing away. So that, I think, is a great example of not working wholeheartedly when we're not being watched. So notice what Paul says again. He says, don't work only while being watched as people pleasers, but work wholeheartedly, fearing the Lord. Now notice Paul doesn't say that our motivation for working hard is a paycheck. And he doesn't say, if the case is for slaves, that the motivation is because you will get into trouble. What he says is the motivation for wholehearted work is that we fear the Lord. So your job is a spiritual job. Whether you are a barber or a cook or a nanny, your job has spiritual ramifications. You are to work wholeheartedly, even when your boss isn't looking, because you're trying to please the Lord. You care, hopefully, what the Lord thinks of your job performance, because He cares how you work. How do you operate when the boss isn't looking? The thing to remember here is that even when you're not being watched by your boss, you're being watched by the Lord. He knows about your job performance. And it seems from what Paul is telling us that Jesus actually cares about your job performance. Now, He may not care so much about the bottom line or the profit margin or the manufacturing output, but He cares about how you work in the job that you're given. You know, I've got a friend who has been asking his pastor for quite some time for a sermon series on work. I sent him a message while I was working on this session, just let him know, hey, I'm working on some teaching about work. Do you have any thoughts about it? And he said, boy, I really need it because right now I'm at my job, I'm in my cubicle, and I'm watching YouTube videos even though there's work to do. Now, generally, this guy gets his work done, but he has a really hard time being motivated to do anything above and beyond. He has a hard time actually doing what this verse says, which is working wholeheartedly. He does the minimum and it's passable, it's good, he gets paid well, he has a good team, but ultimately he has trouble caring about his job. Here's what he asked as we were talking about this. He says, if I don't like my job, should I expect God to give me a passion for it, or should I quit and do something else? Now, I think that's a really good question because we have options that slaves didn't have. So Paul was primarily talking to slaves when he originally wrote this, and slaves didn't have a choice of the kind of work they did. They just were to do what they were told to do. But many workers, many hired workers today, we do have a choice. We have a choice of how and what we do because we live in a nation that is free. There's no shame in going after a career that is easier to put your whole heart into. I mean, if we know that this is our instruction to work wholeheartedly, then what's the problem with looking for a career that you know you can be wholehearted in? I think that's perfectly fine. As long as you continue to take care of your family and fulfill the duties that you're expected to as you maybe go to college or get prepared to do a different career, that's fine. That's something that you have the option and you have the freedom to do. But many people might say this, but what do I do if I'm trapped in a job I hate? You ever felt that? My first job was cleaning cages at a veterinarian clinic. I felt so trapped because I said I would do an entire summer of it. By day one, I felt trapped in that job. So what do we do when we're trapped in a job that we hate? Well, I think the verse is actually pretty clear. Here's where Paul goes with it. As long as you're doing that job, work wholeheartedly, fearing the Lord. You see, these are Paul's words that we need to work wholeheartedly, fearing the Lord. So if you're going to change jobs, that's fine. But up until your very last day, until you are no longer on the clock, you need to continue to do the job that you are expected to do wholeheartedly. If you're on the clock, you need to be working as if it's your one main passion. It needs to fill your entire heart. You need to give yourself to your work until that day that you quit or change careers. So we need to work wholeheartedly. Here's another way to think of it. If a slave can be expected to work wholeheartedly for no pay, then so can I. Whether you think your pay is too low or your benefits are non-existent or you just don't like your job, whatever the case may be, if a slave can be expected to do his work wholeheartedly, then so can you. And my guess is that when you consider the options between being a slave and being a hired worker, you probably have it pretty good. And even for those slaves, Paul encourages them to work wholeheartedly. Now, some might ask this, is Paul endorsing slavery? Is Paul saying that slavery is okay? Well, I think the simple answer is no. In fact, if you read some of Paul's other letters, he implies that a certain slave master ought to let his slave Onesimus go free. Now, that's a talk for another session, but Paul, in my mind, is not supporting or endorsing slavery, especially when we consider what he says a moment later. Notice this in chapter 4, verse 1. At the end of this section, he says, "Masters, deal with your slaves justly and fairly, since you know that you too have a master in heaven." Now, some wonder, why didn't Paul call for the abolition of slavery? I think it's pretty simple, really. Paul has influence over a relatively small number of people. And the people whom Paul has influence over are believers. And so believers are such a small group that Paul is focused on getting them to mature and grow in the faith. Paul knows that he doesn't have political power at this point. And so if he called for the abolition of slavery, it would do basically no good. So what good can Paul do in this situation? Well, what Paul does is he calls for those who are engaged in this system to battle systemic inequality in the system that exists. Now, in history, ultimately it would be Christians many centuries later who would battle against slavery itself in Europe and originally call for the abolition of slavery. So that whole idea came out of Christian thought. But at this point, Paul knows that that is not on the table yet. So here's what he says: masters should be fair and just. They need to offer their slaves fairness and justice. Now, for many slaves, this would mean pretty simple: set them free. If it's debt slavery, you have the ability to simply forgive that debt. If it is criminal slavery, you have the ability to show some mercy. If it is wartime slavery, you have the ability still to either set them free or to give them options to allow them to save money and buy their own freedom or whatever it is. But show them fairness, show them justice. Now, here's one thing to remember. There were slaves that didn't want to go free because their life as slaves were better than their life as private citizens. And so there were certainly slaves that if you said you have the option of going free or not, they'd say, no, I want to stay as part of your household. And that would certainly happen in houses where a master was showing fairness and justice. Now, notice what Paul says the motivation for showing slaves fairness and justice is. It's this: because the boss has a boss in heaven. So the master is not really the master. He is only the human master, but the real master is in heaven. And this helps us as bosses to treat our employees or treat our subordinates well. I'm sure all of us have had bad bosses, right? I've had some in my day. I had a boss who would spray my back with air freshener because he believed I didn't take showers often enough. I knew a guy who had a job with a pretty tough boss, and when he told his boss that he needed to quit and do something else, his boss said, "I'm going to throw you through the window." And he threatened him with physical violence. And so we know lots and lots of stories of bad bosses. In fact, there's an entire movie franchise that's based on this concept. And so bad bosses are all over the place. And it seems like bad bossing comes from this idea that we forget who's really in charge. If you begin to think that you're really in charge, then it's easy to begin to go down that path and begin to treat people in inequitable ways. But what Paul is reminding us is that no one on earth is bossless. So what Paul's saying is that God is the big boss. And when we remember that, we can be better bosses ourselves. Let me give you an example of a man who I think was a great boss. He was in charge of a whole slew of restaurants, had hundreds of employees. I grew up with this guy and I know how he works. Now, one of his philosophies about being a boss is that there are many bosses that just tell people what to do and they go hide in their office until the work is done. But this guy, my friend, did not operate that way. In fact, he believes in working extremely hard as an example for his employees. So when he would show up at one of his stores, one of his restaurants, he would get right in there and help cook. He would clean the toilets. He would scrape the frying pan. He would do whatever any normal worker would do. And by doing that, he would encourage those around him to work hard as well. To me, that's what a great boss looks like. He's serving the needs of his workers by helping them out. And so as people who may have employees or subordinates, this is a very important lesson. We need to consider how we're treating those below us because it matters in eternity. It is a spiritual issue how we treat other people. And so if you have subordinates, I'm guessing you don't have slaves because you're not a slave master, but if you have subordinates or employees, Jesus cares how you treat them. And so he's encouraging us to treat them with fairness and justice. Now, he doesn't just stop with that, but he goes on to give a pretty incredible motivation. I call this the grand motivation for doing wholehearted work. Now, we've looked at this a couple of times so far, but this section tells us why we ought to work wholeheartedly, even at a job that we may not like. Notice what he says here. And whatever you do, do it heartily as to the Lord and not to men, knowing that from the Lord you will receive the reward of the inheritance. For you serve the Lord Christ. But he who does wrong will be repaid for what he has done, and there is no partiality. What we gather from this is that the Lord knows whether we're hardly or heartily working. I certainly want to be someone who is heartily working, that is working with my whole heart in everything that I do. And I know that sometimes I struggle, but this is a huge motivation to remember that the Lord is the one who will fulfill the payroll. It's actually Jesus who will pay us back for our amazing behavior in this life. Now, if a slave is expected to work wholeheartedly, we are too. So even when you're at work, you are serving the Lord. Even if you're serving burgers or you're working in Excel or you are trying to make the next sale, you are working for the Lord. You see, He will pay you back with the reward of the inheritance. Now you may say, what is the reward of the inheritance? This is Paul talking about eternal reward. Eternal reward is not the same thing as salvation or eternal life. It is a bonus, an extra recompense, a repayment for our behavior here. And what Paul is telling us is that the Lord cares about how we operate. He wants us to be wholehearted in the work that we have while we're here on earth. So, it's amazing to think that eternal reward will come for how we behave at our jobs. Now, Jesus may not be so motivated by the profit margin. He may not care nearly as much as certain things that your boss cares about, but He cares how you operate. And I think this is why, because wholehearted workers are building a platform of influence. If you want the opportunity to share the gospel, to share your faith with other co-workers, possibly even your boss, then a great way to build up to that, to kind of build an on-ramp to that moment when you start talking about your faith, is to be trustworthy, is to be wholehearted, and to do an amazing job even in work that is difficult and uncomfortable. And so if you want influence and you want the opportunity to share your faith, then work wholeheartedly, even when you're not being watched. It'll make a huge difference. So here's our bottom line. Work wholeheartedly, and Jesus will reward your work. Well, thanks for watching, and I look forward to being with you in the next session.